In my last video, I talked about the one lens I think every photographer should own. But a lot of you asked the question of whether or not that still applied if you were shooting with an APS-C camera. Now, if you don't know what an APS-C camera is, there are two types of cameras. You have full frame cameras, which are typically considered more professional and are more expensive. And then you also have APS-C or crop sensor cameras, which tend to be a little bit more affordable. So if you're a beginner photographer, what lens should you buy? Well, I still think if you can afford it, a 24-70 f2.8 is the best lens, the best all-around lens that you can get. In that video, I also said if you were on more of a budget, you could get something like a 24-105 f4, because that would give you a comparable zoom focal length range, but at a lower budget and at a slightly lower aperture, a smaller aperture. So if you're shooting on something like a Canon Rebel or a Sony 6000 or an R7 or an R10 or pretty much any Fuji camera, then you're shooting on an APS-C or a crop sensor camera. And so a 24-70 might not fit the typical focal length range that most people are looking for. So a 24-70 on a full frame camera is not going to be quite the same on a crop sensor camera. And that's because of the 1.5 or 1.6 crop factor, where any lens that you put on a crop sensor body is going to be slightly more zoomed in. So what lens do I recommend for a crop sensor camera? Well, what I'm using here is a 17-55, but it's a constant aperture lens. Now, if you do have a kit lens, something like this 18-55, you'll notice it says that it's a variable aperture lens. You can see by looking right in the front, it says 3.5 to 5.6. What that means is as you zoom in and out, the aperture changes, or the opening inside of the camera lens gets larger and smaller depending on how zoomed in you are. Now that can actually be problematic for new photographers because it makes learning how to use your camera a little bit more complicated. So in pretty much every case, if you can afford it, go with a constant aperture lens. Go with something like a 24-70. But if you are on a little bit more of a budget and want to get a lens that matches the camera system that you're shooting with, then you might want to look at something like a 17-55 or a 16-55 and really focus on getting a lens that has a constant aperture. Now, the one caveat to this is you could go with a bunch of prime lenses. Like a constant aperture lens, it's hard to find any that are really under that $800, $900, $1,000 price point. And so if you're someone who only has a few $100 to spend on a camera lens, then your only option might be going with something like this 50mm prime lens or a 35mm prime lens, as long as you understand that in order to use those lenses, you're probably gonna have to swap out your camera lenses a lot more often. So that was just a little piece of clarification for anyone wondering whether or not I still recommended a 24-70. And if you wanna know more about my camera lenses, you can check out that video here or check out my other lens reviews here. And until the next one, go shoot photos.